Lecture 9 for the reproductive system, we're going to take a look inside the ovaries in a female and see what's going on in there. A little bit more complicated than the testes in a male. All right, so ovaries are highly metabolically active little glands, and so they have to have a good blood supply, and that blood supply is brought in by the ovarian arteries, which you learned as the gonadal arteries when we were doing blood drop tracing, but in a female they can also be referred to as the ovarian arteries. Just like you have a tunica albuginea that surrounds the testes in a male, you have a very fibrous connective tissue covering around the ovaries as well. They're very important organs. If we're going to continue the human species, we need ovaries to be protected and stay functional, so they've got a nice tough covering around the outside of them. Incidentally, ovaries and testes in a developing embryo, they're derived from the same structures. It's male sex hormones that are produced in the developing embryo that tell ovaries to become testes and to descend down into the scrotum. So without the influence of male sex hormones, the default is for those structures to become ovaries. So many characteristics about them are the same, and that includes this fibrous connective tissue covering around them called the tunica albuginea. All right, within the ovaries, you do have a cortex and a medulla. So if you think about an ovary as an oval-shaped structure, the cortex, of course, is going to be just like you've seen in other organs and structures in 201 and 202. That's going to be the more superficial portion. The medulla is going to be your juicy center. But it's poorly defined, so it's kind of, that means if you're looking at ovarian tissue under the microscope, it's kind of hard to figure out where the border is between the cortex and the medulla. Okay, some key structures that we'll be talking about in the ovaries are called follicles, or ovarian follicles. And these are not the same as the oocytes. An oocyte is a developing egg cell, and it goes through different stages. All right, so that's an oocyte. And then a follicle is going to be the housing around this egg cell. And there are different types of follicles. They go through different stages. They start off as just one layer of cells surrounding an oocyte, but then they develop into a much more complex structure that includes many layers of cells and even a fluid-filled space on the inside. But those are called follicles. And some of the terminology is going to get confusing as well, because we're going to talk about primary and secondary oocytes, and then we're going to be talking about primary and secondary follicles, and those don't correspond to each other. So you have to keep in mind what you're talking about. All right, so an immature egg or an oocyte is surrounded by granulosa cells. So if we said this is a follicle structure that's composed of many smaller cells surrounding the larger oocyte or egg cell there in the center, the cells that make up the follicle are called granulosa cells. More mature follicles, the larger, more complex ones, have connective tissue coverings around them, and those are called theca. There's a theca interna and a theca externa, but you only see those in the more mature versions. All right, so this cross-section we see here of an ovary that's been cut open. Of course, you see the main artery and vein that are bringing a blood supply to the interior of an ovary. But if you look over here on the left, so this diagram is showing you different stages of follicles and oocytes within the ovary on kind of a time clock scenario. So if you go clockwise around the ovary, you're seeing the structures from their earliest stages to their latest stages. And that does not mean if you cut open an ovary it would be organized this way. Yes, you do have different versions of these structures existing simultaneously in an ovary, but this is a diagram that is just showing you in a timeline type fashion around the ovary what these different structures will look like. So right here, these are called primordial follicles, and we'll be talking more about these, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them on this slide. But those develop into what are called primary follicles, which eventually become secondary follicles, And secondary follicles can become a mature follicle. And this is the type of follicle from which an oocyte is going to emerge from the ovary. So if you see right here, that little orange cell in the center there is a secondary oocyte that has ovulated. It has been released from an ovary, so it has burst out of the follicle. You can see it's actually broken through the wall of the ovary, and it is going to be released into a uterine tube or a fallopian tube. Then notice you got some leftover cells here from that mature follicle that burst open and released that oocyte, and those cells become a structure called the corpus luteum, which is a hormone-producing structure that plays a very important role in the changes that occur along the endometrium in the uterus of a female and help prepare the endometrium to accept a developing embryo if one is going to be fertilized and need to implant. So all of these are different structures we'll be talking about that exist on the inside of the ovaries. So let's talk a little bit more about these different follicle stages. All right, so a primordial follicle has an oocyte on the inside, and it is covered around the outside by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. So squamous means that they're flat. So if you looked at them under the microscope, you'd see a ring of these cells and then this larger oocyte on the inside. Primordial follicles develop into primary follicles, and you still just have a single layer of cells, granulosa cells, that are covering and providing a coating around the oocyte in 3 dimensions, so they're covering the whole spherical shaped oocyte on the inside. But the cells change shape and they become cuboidal, cube-shaped instead of squamous. You've got your oocyte on the inside there. Primary follicles can develop into secondary follicles, and this is where you have multiple layers of these granulosa cells and also some connective tissue coverings develop around those. Those are called theca. There are 2 layers of theca, theca interna and theca externa. And then some secondary follicles will go on to develop into vesicular follicles. Some sources call these tertiary follicles, like 3rd level or mature follicles. Graafian follicle is another name for Graaff, who discovered these. That's a fully mature follicle. Now, in a typical female, each month, only 1 follicle will fully mature and become a vesicular or tertiary follicle. Those follicles are very large, so they can be seen with the naked eye, and they have a fluid-filled space on the inside called the antrum, and the oocyte is sitting in there covered with additional granulosa cells, and we'll be taking a closer look at that later as well. This follicle is so large it bulges from the surface of the ovary, and the secondary oocyte actually bursts out of that follicle during ovulation. And again, in a typical female, on average, just 1 oocyte a month will emerge from one of the 2 ovaries. That's why typically if a female becomes pregnant, she only has 1 developing embryo or fetus. Now, yeah, sometimes more than 1 oocyte does get ovulated. If 2, for example, were ovulated within 1 month and both of those eggs got fertilized by sperm, you would end up with fraternal twins. That's where the twins are non-identical. Okay, and then the corpus luteum, so the leftover granulosa cells that are left over from the mature follicle after it ruptures during ovulation, those cells undergo changes and they become a structure called the corpus luteum, and luteal refers to yellow. So it actually has a yellowish color if you look at it under the microscope. And that is actually an endocrine structure. It produces estrogens and progesterone that are needed to help maintain the inside lining of the uterus to accept a pregnancy. All right, so that was kind of an overview of what's going on in the ovaries. Now we will be returning in more detail to the ovaries when we start talking about the hormonal control of the development of all those follicles, and we've also got to do meiosis with our oocytes. They go through different stages, and we'll talk about those in a later lecture. The next lecture, kind of like we did with the males, now we're going to discuss the secondary sex organs, the reproductive ducts and glands, and the external structures of the female anatomy. Now, the anatomy you've had on the anatomy video lectures, and so the lecture here will focus more on their function.